The 2010s was quite an interesting time for music. It was the decade where the internet had pretty much taken over everybody's lives, and thus the landscape of music adapted accordingly. No longer are we forced to wait to hear our favorite songs on the radio or purchase albums, even though dorks like me still do, when we can just stream everything at the press of a button. This changed a lot of things for music, such as the way it's marketed, the way sales are calculated, and how people go about consuming it. Whether or not this change is a good thing is kinda debatable. You can make the argument that the value of music, both financially and as an art form, has become somewhat bastardized. With the entire history of the art form right at our fingertips, it becomes easy to take a lot of it for granted. Unlike 15 years ago, when if you spent $16 on a Kevin Federline CD, you best believe you were listening to that over and over for months, regardless of how much it sucked. Ultimately though, this shift in the way music is consumed has allowed for more bold innovation than ever before. Platforms like Bandcamp, SoundCloud, and even the major streaming services give basically everyone a platform to share their music, and while this has led to a lot of oversaturation of mediocrity or just straight up dog shit, it's also allowed for a plethora of musical movements in both the mainstream and the underground that couldn't have happened in any other generation. In past decades, underground music genres were largely confined to the regions they were born out of, thus limiting the direct influence that those genres could have had on other ones. Now that pretty much anyone with an internet connection can listen to anything and even possibly gain a following of their own without the need of a major label, the community aspect of modern music has been heightened greater than ever before. I've come up with a list of 108 records that all stand as big high points for me in music of this decade. I went with 108 because 1, I'm talking about an entire 10 years worth of music, so I wanted to be thorough, and 2, it's in the name of my channel, so it seemed kinda cute. Even though that number may sound really high, there's still a lot of bands and artists who I love that didn't make the list, so if some of your favorites aren't here, then I might be just as pissed at me as you are. Also, I know I put the word best in the title, but it's more of a favorites list than a best list. We really don't have the retrospect to truly determine what the best of the entire decade was, seeing as how it just ended. The way this is gonna work is I'm gonna review all of these albums in like a sentence or two, and then go more in depth about the top 10. Sound good with everyone? Okay, cool.
Well, that's one way to start a list. This right here, it's pretty diggable. When you say alternative R&B, this is the type of stuff I think of. Noise artists and grindcore bands work so well together, why doesn't this happen more often? This album kinda inspired a whole wave of jazz and sound collage fused hip hop that I've been trying to call post-hop, but it's not quite catching on yet. Vocals are an underutilized instrument in ambient music. Who needs lean when you have die lit? Not gonna lie, I did wet the bed listening to this. It's like untrue, but in color. Also, the best Young Thug song is on here. Bad mixing makes cloud rap even cloudier. Proof that of Montreal only gets the best musicians to play with them. So I know the Midwest emo revival is easy to make fun of, but this thing's nice. A really great swan song for the band to end on. These don't exist. Did I mention I love cloud rap? The best non-existent musical of the decade. Only Daft Punk could bring back disco and have it be cool. If you walk around while listening to this, you'll feel like you're in a spy movie. One of the most dynamic and effectively dread-inducing pop albums of the decade. Proof that you don't need good recording equipment to make great music. Guys, hear me out. Rapping over classical music. Alvin and the Chipmunks for metalheads. You've heard of noise rock, but what about rock noise? Ghost figured out that the answer to making classic hard rock work in this era is to be as campy as possible. Yeah, I like Young Lean, okay? He's good, shut up. Pitchfork chord done right. Proof that vaporwave is so much more than playing a 45 at 33. Jazz had a pretty solid decade. Radiohead somehow made their saddest album yet. Raw energy, great songwriting, one of the most consistent punk records of the decade easily. Guyve made an excellent comeback with one of their dronier and most action-packed releases so far. Too bad they didn't stay this way. Nobody needs to rap about coke again after this. I can't understand the words, but I bet they're brilliant. Song topics include being a weeb and turning into a cat. 2 words. Prog grips. This album is too low, 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 this album is too low. Folk and electronic music have never sounded so great together. Yeah. I'm not kidding. This is one of the most raw and uncomfortable expressions of coping with death ever recorded. Maybe a bit of a hot take, but if the title track didn't suck so much, I'd have this about as high as Igor. Don't tell anyone I said that. Also, spoilers, Igor's gonna be on here. A futuristic sci-fi battle of man versus machine told through oddball synths and sludgy guitars. I get nervous around this album because it's so pretty. I know I gave this thing a 10 when it initially came out, and while I'm not as hype on it now, it's still a great album that I think defines a new era of jazz. It's like if the Fallout games were an album. Art rap really needs to be a more widely spread genre tag. This thing becomes so much better when you view it as a comedy album. I love the way that cloud rap's currently evolving into this more ambient sound. Gets me excited to see where the genre goes in the 2020s. Jazz covers of video game music and hip hop songs? Yes. If Merriweather Post Pavilion never existed, then this would be as well liked as Feels. We can now add Beyonce to the list of artists whose best album is a live album. Pitchfork put this at number 1, so I get 59 hipster points. It's like the Casino Nights theme, but with a bunch of samples and for 2 hours. Puts a lot of big instrument sections into a punk context really seamlessly. The overall vibe reminds me of a Tim Schafer game. Kinda feels like a modern version of There's a Riot Going On. This album will turn you into a drug addict and then convince you to go to rehab. Insert joke about the album being named after its fans here. I didn't know the guy who hosted Family Feud in the 90s made a freak folk album. Paul White really doesn't get talked about enough for how much amazing production he's done this decade. Man, being single sucks. This is what rap sounds like to someone who inhaled too many expo markers in kindergarten.
It's like Twilight, but with no vampires and actually interesting.
The best kept secret in pop music. I know a lot of people write this band off for being too cutesy, but this album sees them taking some pretty bold experiments, with the cutesiness acting more as a secondary trait to make them stand out. The best rap concept album of the decade that isn't by Kendrick. Not to get political, but the fuck is a neoclassical dark wave? Yeah, I like the front bottoms, okay? They're good, shut up. We can now add David Bowie to the list of artists who made an existential masterpiece right before their death. 2 of these artists overlap with the live albums list. Okay, now this is epic. I'm really sorry guys, I had to do it. It's like I'm in a horror movie and I'm about to be killed, but instead of running, I'm just headbanging to the soundtrack. I throw in any song on here and 20 minutes just flies by. It's like stream of consciousness sound. Every track is like a super detailed drum circle with a crazy woman's voice over it. A$AP Rock is even more enjoyable when you can understand what he's talking about. Man, I could listen to this thing forever. Probably the most consistent and forward-thinking cloud rap album of the decade. Yeah. This was actually my favorite Death Grips album for a while, and while my taste in music has become a lot broader since then, I actually can't blame my younger self for this one. I'd probably talk about this a hell of a lot more often if I remembered how to pronounce or spell it. It's like I'm getting thrown off of a building over and over for 14 minutes. Madlib's really still got it after all these years. Oh, and Freddie's cool too. This managed to be one of both Cudi and Kanye's most ambitious albums, despite not even being 25 minutes. This is probably the best rap comeback album ever. Did you know even David Bowie was inspired by this? This is kinda like if Free Churro was an album. I was gonna just put 3 here, but why do that when I can put all of them? What's this? A lo-fi pop album where the sound quality isn't just a gimmick? I really do feel like I'm in a building that's on fire and I have to exit. They took this thing off streaming services recently and I'm still bummed. Oh wait, it's back up? Well, dang it, the stroke doesn't make any sense. This thing really proves how timeless the Memphis rap sound is. God damn! I really wish I didn't have to label so many great albums as intelligent dance music. The most cinematic album in all of hip-hop. I'm no psychic, but I can maybe see Deconstructed Club taking over in the 2020s. That might even make a good video topic. This album lives up to its name in that it's edgy. She set out to make 12 parts, and only 4 have come out so far. Can't wait to pre-order the 12 LP box set in 2035. Some of the best chamber folk in the modern era, and 3 whole discs of it. Yeah, I know it's technically a compilation, and half the songs are old and the other half are posthumous, but hearing them all together makes this feel like the magnum opus that Nujabe's always wanted to release. The best 7-track album of the decade. Sorry, Kanye. Same. This album really defines indie in the 2010s, only instead of filler bits between choruses, it's interesting rap verses with motifs that tie the whole thing together. Look, I know this thing's polarizing, but this was my most listened to album last year.
Okay, with that out of the way, here's my top 10. You can really take the order of this entire list with a grain of salt, as I love every single one of these records for entirely different reasons than one another, so the ranking is more based on how often I've revisited them, or how well I feel they're executed. Now that we're in the top 10 though, the statement applies even further. I think that all of these albums are masterpieces, I would give them all perfect scores, and to me they're all equally brilliant. You could probably switch around the rankings for all of them and it wouldn't make much of a difference, except for maybe the top 3. With that out of the way though, here's my top 10. My favorite bodies of work from any artist. In fact, I could probably make an entire video about why M.I.A is one of the most important albums of the decade, and yes, I even enjoyed AIM. Well, guess now's the time to talk about it. The follow-up album to M.I.A.'s commercial breakthrough, which is a term I'm using pretty loosely as her music isn't exactly what you'd think of when you hear the word commercial, was possibly her most avant-garde and left-field release so far, which if you've heard the last 2 is saying a lot. Pretty much everyone, both fans and critics, were put off by it at first, calling the album repetitive, obnoxious, and as rhetorically effective as someone in a dorm room ranting about the CIA inventing AIDS. Recently though, it seems like more people have come around on the record, as it's proven itself to be one of the most predictive albums of the decade in a multitude of ways. Firstly, the album's themes of the quickly evolving internet age catching up to and taking over many parts of people's everyday lives, which is clearly established in both the music and the cover art, are even more relevant today than they were in 2010. Secondly, the album's blend of cacophonous sample choices, blaring synthesizers, and bizarre vocal effects would pretty much set the groundwork for the next wave of industrial hip-hop, as well as the very recently coined Deconstructed Club. Taking both of these things aside though, and just looking at the music, M.I.A is still one of the most unique and brilliantly crafted pop albums of this generation. For as experimental and messy as this album is, it never loses the catchiness and memorability that you'd expect from a great pop album. The vocal melodies and leading synths still ring out amidst the rough mixing and unconventional layers. Seriously, I guarantee you cuts like Tell Me Why, It Is What It Is, and Space will be stuck in your head after just a couple listens. How the leading single, XXXO, feels like a deconstructed and almost psychedelic take on a Lady Gaga song. While the album isn't as high on the genre fusions from around the world that you typically get out of an M.I.A. record, it makes up for that by focusing solely on filtering the landscape of modern electropop through as many weird lenses as possible. The record feels focused, yet still as eclectic and unpredictable as any of her other projects. We're getting one artistic left hook after another, from the glitched out rhythms on Love a Lot, the pop reggae crossover on It Takes a Muscle, and the bombastic synth punk of Born Free, which takes a Suicide sample and makes it sound more explosive than ever before. It's also worth noting that this track had a really controversial music video that illustrated a genocide in the town that she was born in, using visuals that were easier for Westerners to comprehend, yet just as difficult to stomach. Something else that I love about this record is how it totally captures M.I.A.'s attitude towards mainstream culture and the need to speak out against issues that aren't being talked about. After being given a mainstream platform with the commercial success of Kala, she wanted to push her audience as far out of their comfort zone as possible with the fleeting time she'd inevitably have in the mainstream. With that in mind, it only makes sense that she'd be sued by the NFL for flipping off the camera during a Super Bowl performance and make a music video that was temporarily banned from YouTube. I swear she's like this generation's Rage Against the Machine. But even now that she isn't as controversial as she once was, the music on this album and really throughout her discography still stands on its own as some of the most forward-thinking and enjoyable to come out of the entire generation. If you were put off by this before because of the initial reception or whatever other reason, I'd urge you to go back and try it again, as I really find it to be some of the most impressive music of this decade. James Leland Kirby, who's been dabbling in making music since the 90s under a slew of various monikers, found a lot of success throughout the decade with his Caretaker project. The compositional basis of his music is to take samples from 30s and 40s jazz recordings and give them a sound that's dusty and unsettling, yet with the grooviness left intact. The theme that shines through in pretty much all of his music released under this name is that it's a portrayal of mental illness, specifically Alzheimer's. And Empty Bliss Beyond This World communicates this in not just its music, but in the track titles and cover art. This image perfectly sums up the effects of the disease, having a completely blank boulder with a cigarette attached, symbolizing the forgetfulness of the people in your life and what they look like. Musically, the album starts off kind of upbeat and catchy, but in the most unsettling way imaginable. It's like the music to soundtrack a serial killer movie or something like that. The deeper we get into the track list, the more incomprehensible the music becomes, getting covered by crackles and silence, with the last song, The Sublime is Disappointingly Elusive, feeling like a send-off to this person's life. Looking at the track list, you'll notice that some songs are listed multiple times, each time recycling the sample from the last, but made to sound even more buried. Despite having no lyrics at all, this is arguably one of the saddest albums of the decade, and certainly a high point for ambient and sample-based music period. Rarely do I hear sample-based albums that tell such a vivid and complete story entirely by the way the samples are placed and reworked, especially without the use of lyrics. I know that a lot of other people would probably put his 6-stage opus Everywhere at the End of Time in this spot, but if I'm being honest, I've yet to hear that thing all the way through. Guys, I'm sorry, look, it's 6 hours long, okay, I'll get to it in due time. This album effectively communicates all of the themes of the Caretaker's music in a very digestible and sometimes even catchy package. It's pretty accessible in the grander scheme of ambient music, with melodies that are easy to cling on to and a soundscape that crumbles so slowly that you barely start to notice until the very end. Absolute masterpiece in modern music, and one of the best sample-based albums ever created. Speaking of concept albums, Janelle Monáe really outdid herself on her 2010 debut. It's part of an interconnected concept, being the second and third suite of 4 or 5, or I guess 7, but the last 2 haven't been made yet. Anyway, it continues the narrative of her Cindy Mayweather persona that she established on her 2007 EP Metropolis. To briefly summarize what I get out of the story from this album is it follows that character, being a robot, falling in love with a human named Anthony Greendown, but they can't be in love because robots are marginalized and discriminated against, and Cindy fights against this oppression so that she may be with her lover. The way this allegory plays off of the science fiction setting is very effective, creating a compelling narrative with themes of Afrofuturism akin to artists like Sun Ra and Parliament Funkadelic. What also sets this record apart for me is the sheer ambition and the number of styles she's able to cover so seamlessly. Remember with the plucky rhythms of funk music, irresistible and soul-tinged synth pop that evokes the likes of Prince and Michael Jackson, the hard-hitting bass, percussion, and rap verses of hip-hop reminding me mostly of Outkast, and I'm not just saying that because of the Big Boy feature, and this is only the first half of the album. She takes all of these retro styles, but rather than feeling gimmicky or nostalgia pandering, it's completely recontextualized for the modern era and fitting to the album's narrative. As we get to the second half of the record, or the third suite, things get much more psychedelic and experimental. We get beautifully arranged strings and brass on cuts like Neon Valley Street and the epic 9-minute closer Ba-Bop Ba Ya, to the straight art pop of Wonderland and Say You'll Go. It's more like something you'd hear out of a modern indie pop album, which is only further emphasized by the Of Montreal feature on Make the Bus. While these two suites sound completely different from each other, they're equally masterful and show off just how many styles Janelle is able to execute near flawlessly. She's a truly one-of-a-kind artist, and while the ArchAndroid may be damn near impossible for her to top, she's yet to release a project that I don't love, and I look forward to seeing what she does in the 2020s.
Spent a day with my dad and his old friend.
I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with Mark Kozlik. I love his work in Red House Painters, but once he started Kil Moon, he doubled down on this extremely overworded and nearly amelodic approach to songwriting that's as distinct as it is polarizing. While I don't love records like Ghosts of the Great Highway, Your April as much as most others seem to, hell, I actually prefer the Modest Mouse Covers album, I've grown a soft spot for Mark's approach to the genre. When he is able to make a great track, it's really great. Nowhere is this different style of songwriting better executed and exemplified than on his 2014 magnum opus Benji. While the album is just as rambly and at times incoherent as its predecessors, every single track showcases just how much charm and personality Mark's style of songwriting can have. I know I said the album's incoherent at times, but it's never to a track's detriment. Songs like Michael Lean, Ben's My Friend, and I Watched the Film, The Song Remains the Same all tell a bunch of stories that have seemingly nothing to do with each other, and while something as simple as ordering crab cakes, visiting old friends, or regrets from elementary school might not sound like a compelling story, the way they're written and performed over the layered and primitive guitar playing gives these songs a sense of charm that no other singer-songwriter album I've heard this decade quite has. Don't go into this thing expecting a bunch of silly and quirky stories though, as the overall tone of this album is quite the opposite. Many of the stories told include the loss of loved ones or local tragedies, with the guitar playing further adding to the mood. Even the album's sweeter moments, like all of the odes to family, are still pretty emotional when paired with all the other stories, yet the album never loses its sense of optimism. This is conveyed through its subtle yet poignant sense of humor that's prevalent on cuts like Dogs and I Love My Dad. I may not be the biggest Mark Kozlik fan overall, especially with what he's doing nowadays. God, these records are boring. But Benji has moved me in a way that few other records this decade have, and sees the singer-songwriter formula get completely flipped on its head in a way that works out beautifully. Death Grips is a group that really needs no introduction at this point. Whether you think these guys are brilliant for their constant and hard to pin down genre fusions that have inspired much of the modern music landscape in recent years, or think it's all total bullshit, you can't deny their consistency over the last decade. Nearly every year, these guys released a project that was as refreshing, original, and challenging as the last, leading to a lot of argument over which one is their best. If you ask me though, I'd have to give it to their monstrous double album, The Powers That Be. The first disc of this album released in 2014, and then the band said, yeah, we're breaking up, sorry y'all, and then everyone was like, no, Jenny Death won, and then they were like, we're not actually breaking up, we're just a bunch of jokesters. The two parts of The Powers That Be are very different from each other. The first, and my favorite of the two, plays out totally seamlessly, offering 8 tracks and 30 minutes of unrelentingly noisy glitch hop, full of constantly shifting musical passages and a surprising amount of memorable hooks. What really makes this disc one of modern hip-hop's true masterpieces, though, is the way it handles vocal samples. Obviously, taking a snippet of someone's voice from an old R&B, jazz, or pop song and reworking it into a hip-hop beat is nothing new, but Death Grips takes this concept and flips it totally on its head. Firstly, the way these vocal samples are so delicately weaved directly into the rhythm section not only makes it sound totally different from your local Madlib or Dilla ripoff, but completely shatters the line between what sections are even meant to be melodic and rhythmic in context of one another. This makes the music stick with me on a whole other level that no other album I've heard in the genre quite has. Secondly, every single vocal snippet that gets sampled on this disc is from none other than the great Björk, who has a pretty polarizing voice to begin with, but one that fits perfectly in context of what the group is doing. Seriously, I can't imagine anyone else's voice being used here, and the fact that they chose to only sample one voice for the entirety of the record only helps to make it sound more cohesive. Being a fan of Björk as well, I really loved hearing what could more or less be seen as a collaborative album between the two, or a spiritual successor to Medulla. The way this album challenges what can be done with samples is remaining light levels of forward thinking. The long-awaited second disc, Jenny Death, while not as conceptual or seamless as its predecessor, has maybe the most consistent tracklist of any Death Grips project. It sees the band continuing to push themselves forward, taking their established songwriting talents on records like The Money Store and No Love Deep Web, and giving themselves a more organic and noisy sound than ever before. We hear the band dabble with electric guitars, more unrestricted synths, and MC Rye giving his most ear-piercingly passionate vocal performances so far. The songs mostly go by a pretty conventional structure, but with the memorable hooks and verses we've come to expect out of a Death Grips record. The way these two discs play off of each other on one single album acts as the ultimate display of what these guys are all about, giving one extended and seamless masterpiece that pushes electronic music and hip-hop to its very limits, and then following it up with the abrasive and catchy goodness of the group's previous releases, but with a new coat of paint and a very tight track list. It's a pure masterwork in modern music, and while it might not be the group's most accessible project, it's easily their most groundbreaking and definitive. I already talked about this album in my best of 2019 video, which, by the way, spoilers, it was kinda high on that list, so I'll keep it a little more brief here. Caligula is a disturbing journey into the mind of an abuse victim, but one that doesn't rely on external imagery to get its message across. Everything is told from the perspective of the victim's internal psyche, and the damage that she's faced while being in this relationship. This allows the album to be as vast and otherworldly as possible, while still being entirely real. The sounds that Hater uses to convey these emotions ranges from giant vocal harmonies and epic piano sections to harsh bits of industrial music and screamed vocals. It's a biblical experience, and one that comes across as a battle of good and evil inside the mind of a victim. There's so many moments on here that are just skin-crawlingly powerful, like her appreciation of Eileen Warren's on If the Poison Won't Take You, My Dogs Will, or the stunning and perfectly paced build-up of Do You Doubt Me, Traitor. We see Hater undergo this metamorphosis of someone who's hurt to someone who's been morphed into this hate and aggression-filled beast as a result of this experience. It's communicated using an uncommon but perfectly fitting sonic palette, combining the big instrument sections of chamber music with the ear-shredding electronics of Death Industrial. It's far from an easy listen, and I know the album's heavy subject matter, slow compositions, and abrasive sounds are going to turn away a lot of listeners, but I think it's something everyone needs to hear nonetheless.
Sugar in my gas tank, my cushion was a bosom on bad days.
Earl Sweatshirt is probably my favorite artist of the decade. I'm not as hype on his earlier work as a lot of others are, because I feel like he was yet to come into his own creatively and wore his very obvious influences directly on his sleeve. That being said though, he did show a lot of potential, and all of that potential shined through in the latter half of the decade. Since the cold, dejected, and subtle yet technical sound of I Don't Like Shit, I Don't Go Outside in 2015, Earl established a style for himself that he just kept expanding upon with each release. Arguably the climax of his entire career so far is his brief but bold 2018 album Some Rap Songs. This thing is only 25 minutes long, yet packs in more content than most albums that are double its length. Earl has done nothing but improve as a lyricist over the years, and the cryptic and sad poetry that shows up all over this record is nothing short of fascinating. What's even more fascinating though is the atmosphere that Earl creates within all of these tracks. The instrumentals on here are all fairly simple rap beats with looped samples carrying a heavy J Dilla influence, but what makes the overall sound of these tracks stand out is the mixing. Earl's voice sounds like it was recorded on a cheap microphone in a room with 20-foot high ceilings, with the beats carrying a similarly rough demeanor. Despite this though, Earl's bars are easy to make out for the most part, and the music stays away from sounding like those 24/7 lo-fi hip-hop streams. I've seen a lot of people hate on this album for its mixing, yet I find it to be one of its most standout qualities. It doesn't sound lazily produced so much as it does meticulously assembled to sound as isolated and alienating as possible. It perfectly conveys all of the trippy and disconnected emotions that are spoken upon in the lyrics, with each track being short and to the point. There's very little, if anything, in the way of hooks, playing out more like a collection of verses on top of abstract musical ideas rather than traditional songs, contrary to what the title may lead you to believe. While Earl's influences are still felt throughout the record, they never distracted me from what was being presented, especially with how forward-thinking the music is. I talked briefly earlier about Standing on the Corner and how I feel their style of sound collage jazz and spoken word tinged hip-hop is indicative of a new wave of artists who are taking the genre in a whole new direction, and this record right here is maybe the most popular one in that new wave. While it isn't nearly as high on its genre fusions, it carries a similar overall sound in its sample choices, the way it's mixed, and oh hey, would you look at that? What I'm ultimately saying is that I feel like this album has already had an impact on the progression of underground hip-hop in the very short time that it's been out, and I look forward to seeing what it inspires and what Earl releases in the future.
Just waking up feeling like I said, gotta keep an eye on all your friends.
Danny Brown is one of modern hip-hop's most eccentric characters. I love the way he celebrates while also deconstructing hip-hop norms like lyrics about partying and drug culture and production that's bass-heavy and sample-driven. Danny handles these things in a way that no other rapper does, filtering them through an insane lens that brilliantly communicates both the highs and lows of this lifestyle. His 2011 breakout project XXX handles this topic with somewhat minimal but completely outside of the box beat selection and a yelped vocal delivery that makes him sound like he's having fun while also realizing that his life is falling apart. Combined with the obscene punchlines and to-the-point song structures, it's one of the most memorable and impressive rap albums of the decade. I mean, it made my list for a reason. As much as I love that record, it does become a little too on the nose with its message in the second half, and there's maybe a couple too many tracks on it, but overall it's pretty excellent. After going a little more commercial but still maintaining good songwriting and production on Old, Danny signed to Warp Records, where he now had both the artistic freedom and expertise to make his true magnum opus Abacus Atrocity Exhibition. Pretty much everything I said about XXX applies to this album, only the tracklist is a little bit tighter, and everything is crazier! The beats on here tend to come across more as odd musical experiments than rap beats, with a slight post-punk influence coming through in the sample choices. Most of the beats on this album sound like they couldn't have been rapped over in any way other than Danny's trademark style, and let me tell you, he sounds more unrestricted than ever. He's like a modern day version of Old Dirty Bastard in the latter half of his career. The otherworldly sound that this album creates makes you feel like you're on drugs and going on this downward spiral with Danny that he establishes on track 1. There's a couple of songs that see him rapping in a more calm tone of voice, and combined with the hazy and quieted production on these cuts, communicates just how depressed Danny feels whenever he's sober. That being said though, the album never feels as black and white as an anti-drug PSA. Rather, it feels like a complete depiction of what somebody who dabbles in heavy drug usage goes through, communicating both the highs and the lows. It's such a vivid, multi-layered, and addictive record that I'll no doubt continue revisiting for years to come. I plan on giving these guys their own video in the near future, but damn, if you've heard this thing, you know. These guys often get grouped with the Midwest emo revival, a term that I'm not all that fond of for a few reasons. One, the word revival implies that the genre went away for a long period of time and came back, which isn't really the case, as there's plenty of quality Midwest emo releases in the time the genre supposedly died and was revived. Secondly, the term emo revival has like 1,000 different meanings depending on who you ask, and all of them have their own subgenres that are pretty easy to distinguish from one another. I swear, to people who don't listen to emo, it's like every subgenre is just the emo revival. And third, pretty much every one of these revivals just consists of a ton of bands trying to copy one specific band, whether that be American Football, Orchid, or Refused. The Brave Little Abacus, though, doesn't really sound like any of these bands, or any other emo band period for that matter. The only thing vaguely emo about this album are its lyrics, which we'll come back to later, and the very passionate and nasally vocal performances. The band's frontman, Adam Demirijan, has been documented more as a fan of early punk and classic rock than someone who takes direct inspiration from emo, which is even further evidenced by his new musical project, Me and Capri's, carrying a clear influence from the latter. As far as this album goes though, I can't really pin down a clear influence from any band, which is something I can't say about the vast majority of rock records from the 2010s. Despite the recording of this album being relatively lo-fi, the musical ambition isn't lost at all. Aside from your typical guitar, bass, and drums, there's melodic brass sections, sad harmonicas, triumphant wind chimes, driving keyboard arpeggios, Malcolm in the Middle samples. There's so much going on that keeps every moment entirely unpredictable, and when combined with the linear song structures, feels as grandiose as a King Crimson record, all while keeping nearly every track well under 5 minutes. Now that's impressive. I understand if the record comes across as a total mess upon your first listen because its unconventional rhythms and loud instrumentation is a bit overwhelming with the lo-fi recording, but after getting used to its overall aesthetic, everything becomes so easy to pick apart and appreciate. On top of all this is the vocals, which, as I said earlier, do have a very nasally and I guess you could say whiny sound that you'd expect from an emo record, even though that's just how Adam sounds normally. I hate the way I talk. Hey, don't be so hard on yourself, man. I love your voice. The album's lyrical themes often center around things like anxiety and self-doubt, but has some of the most interesting and dense songwriting I've ever heard. More often than not, the lyrics are pretty difficult to make out due to how they're delivered and how the album was recorded, and usually when this is the case, I'd say that the lyrics don't matter, but I'd highly recommend reading through them while you listen anyway. There's a few motifs that show up on multiple tracks that are easy to pick up on whether you're reading the lyrics or not, like Two of Them and One of Me, which eventually switches to Two of Me and One of Them, as well as the name Hannah Green. I have some theories about this album's lyrics, but I'll talk about that in a later video. This is easily among my favorite albums of all time from one of my favorite bands of all time, and by far the greatest rock album of the decade. What could be better than this one? Well... And let me tell you about my life. Painkillers only put me in a twilight. Yeah, it's To Pimp a Butterfly. I mean, come on, it's pretty much untouchable for me. What can I even say about this thing that everyone hasn't already said? You all know why it's amazing, with its poem that reveals more and more of itself as the album goes on, the interview with Tupac from Beyond the Grave, the incredible production, verses, and different personalities Kendrick is able to take on from track to track, the creative use of guest performances, and even catchy hooks. Everyone's already sung this thing's praises, and it'll no doubt be mentioned alongside the greatest albums of all time, if it isn't already. So instead, I'll talk a little bit about why this thing is so special to me personally. This was the first album that I ever became truly obsessed with. I was in middle school when it came out, which I guess wasn't that long ago, and I bought it off the iTunes store. Yeah, remember that thing? It's gone now. I pretty much spent the entirety of 8th grade completely fascinated by it. I would listen to the whole thing multiple times every day, trying to break down the meaning of every lyric, spoken word bit, and how the music connects it all. While I've had similar obsessive phases with a lot of albums since this one, including pretty much everything close to the top of this list, I don't think any album will ever top the experience I had with this when it came out. This thing gave me a deeper appreciation for music as an art form, and especially the album format. Needless to say, without this record, I probably wouldn't have started any of this internet music stuff, like the Instagram page and this YouTube channel. I even wrote a really long review of this thing all the way back in 2016, but please don't read it because I'm sure it's terrible. This may seem like kind of an anticlimactic way to close out the list because I'm making it all about me, but from a musical standpoint, the album is still absolutely brilliant. Its fusions of jazz, hip-hop, funk, soul, and spoken word are all beautiful, and reciting a piece of a poem after nearly every track and having each line relate to a song on the album is something that I don't think has ever been attempted before, and yet it works out perfectly. If you're somehow watching this video and haven't heard this thing yet, then I don't know what else to say. What are you doing? Give it a shot. And that was it. I can now move on with my life and stop living in the past. Let me know what some of your favorite albums of the decade are and what I might have missed. I also want to give a big thank you to helping me surpass 1,000 subscribers. I seriously wasn't expecting that to happen so soon, if at all.
Oh hey, 108, would you look at that?
Once again, you guys are the best, and if you like the video, you know the drill.
My God, that stinks.